Buddha, Sanskrit. Awakened One, clan name, Sanskrit. Gautama or Pali. Gotama, personal name, Sanskrit. Siddhartha or Pali. Siddhattha, born circa 6th-4th century BCE, Lumbini, near Kapilavastu, Shakya Republic, Kosala Kingdom, now in Nepal, died, Kusinara, Malla Republic, Magadha Kingdom, now Kasia, India, the founder of Buddhism, one of the major religions and philosophical systems of southern and eastern Asia and of the world. Buddha is one of the many epithets of a teacher who lived in northern India sometime between the 6th and the 4th century before the Common Era. His followers, known as Buddhists, propagated the religion that is known today as Buddhism. The title Buddha was used by a number of religious groups in ancient India and had a range of meanings, but it came to be associated most strongly with the tradition of Buddhism and to mean an enlightened being, one who has awakened from the sleep of ignorance and achieved freedom from suffering. According to the various traditions of Buddhism, there have been Buddhas in the past and there will be Buddhas in the future. Some forms of Buddhism hold that there is only one Buddha for each historical age. Others hold that all beings will eventually become Buddhas because they possess the Buddha nature, Tathagatagarbha. All forms of Buddhism celebrate various events in the life of the Buddha Gautama, including his birth, enlightenment, and passage into nirvana. In some countries the three events are observed on the same day, which is called Wesak in Southeast Asia. In other regions the festivals are held on different days and incorporate a variety of rituals and practices. The birth of the Buddha is celebrated in April or May, depending upon the lunar date, in these countries. In Japan, which does not use a lunar calendar, the Buddha's birth is celebrated on April 8th. The celebration there has merged with a native Shinto ceremony into the flower festival known as Hanamatsuri. The clan name of the historical figure referred to as the Buddha, whose life is known largely through legend, was Gautama, in Sanskrit, or Gautama, in Pali, and his given name was Siddhartha, Sanskrit, he who achieves his aim, or Siddhattha, in Pali. He is frequently called Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya clan. In Buddhist texts, he is most commonly addressed as Bhagavat, often translated as Lord, and he refers to himself as the Tathagata, which can mean either one who has thus come, or one who has thus gone. Information about his life derives largely from Buddhist texts, the earliest of which were not committed to writing until shortly before the beginning of the Common Era, several centuries after his death. The events of his life set forth in these texts cannot be regarded with confidence as historical, although his historical existence is accepted by scholars. He is said to have lived for 80 years, but there is considerable uncertainty concerning the date of his death. Traditional sources on the date of his death are, in the language of the tradition, passage into nirvana, range from 2420 BCE to 290 BCE. Scholarship in the 20th century limited this range considerably, with opinion generally divided between those who placed his death about 480 BCE and those who placed it as much as a century later. Historical context. The Buddha was born in Lumbini, Rumandai, near Kapilavastu, Kapilavastu, on the northern edge of the Ganges River Basin, an area on the periphery of the civilization of North India, in what is today southern Nepal. Scholars speculate that during the late Vedic period the peoples of the region were organized into tribal republics, ruled by a council of elders or an elected leader. The grand palaces described in the traditional accounts of the life of the Buddha are not evident among the archaeological remains. It is unclear to what extent these groups at the periphery of the social order of the Ganges basin were incorporated into the caste system, but the Buddha's family is said to have belonged to the warrior, Kshatriya, caste. The central Ganges basin was organized into some 16 city-states, ruled by kings, often at war with each other. The rise of these cities of central India, with their courts and their commerce, brought social, political, and economic changes that are often identified as key factors in the rise of Buddhism and other religious movements of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Buddhist texts identify a variety of itinerant teachers who attracted groups of disciples. Some of these taught forms of meditation, yoga, and asceticism and set forth philosophical views, focusing often on the nature of the person and the question of whether human actions, karma, have future effects. Although the Buddha would become one of these teachers, Buddhists view him as quite different from the others. His place within the tradition, therefore, cannot be understood by focusing exclusively on the events of his life and times, even to the extent that they are available. Instead, he must be viewed within the context of Buddhist theories of time and history. According to Buddhist doctrine, the universe is the product of karma, the law of the cause and effect of actions, according to which virtuous actions create pleasure in the future and non-virtuous actions create pain. The beings of the universe are reborn without beginning in 6 realms, as gods, demigods, humans, animals, ghosts, and hell beings. The actions of these beings create not only their individual experiences but the domains in which they dwell. The cycle of rebirth, called samsara, literally, wandering, is regarded as a domain of suffering, and the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice is to escape from that suffering. The means of escape remains unknown until, over the course of millions of lifetimes, a person perfects himself, ultimately gaining the power to discover the path out of samsara and then compassionately revealing that path to the world. A person who has set out on the long journey to discover the path to freedom from suffering, and then to teach it to others, is called a bodhisattva. A person who has discovered that path, followed it to its end, and taught it to the world is called a Buddha. Buddhas are not reborn after they die but enter a state beyond suffering called nirvana, literally, passing away. Because Buddhas appear so rarely over the course of time and because only they reveal the path to liberation, moksha, from suffering, dukkha, the appearance of a Buddha in the world is considered a momentous event in the history of the universe. The story of a particular Buddha begins before his birth and extends beyond his death. It encompasses the millions of lives spent on the bodhisattva path before the achievement of Buddhahood and the persistence of the Buddha, in the form of both his teachings and his relics, after he has passed into nirvana. The historical Buddha is regarded as neither the first nor the last Buddha to appear in the world. According to some traditions he is the 7th Buddha, according to another he is the 25th, according to yet another he is the 4th. The next Buddha, named Maitreya, will appear after Shakyamuni's teachings and relics have disappeared from the world. The traditional accounts of the events in the life of the Buddha must be considered from this perspective. Sources of the life of the Buddha. Accounts of the life of the Buddha appear in many forms. Perhaps the earliest are those found in the collections of sutras, Pali, suttas, discourses traditionally attributed to the Buddha. In the sutras, the Buddha recounts individual events in his life that occurred from the time that he renounced his life as a prince until he achieved enlightenment 6 years later. Several accounts of his enlightenment also appear in the sutras. One Pali text, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, Discourse on the Final Nirvana, describes the Buddha's last days, his passage into nirvana, his funeral, and the distribution of his relics. Biographical accounts in the early sutras provide little detail about the Buddha's birth and childhood, although some sutras contain a detailed account of the life of a prehistoric Buddha, Vipashian. Another category of early Buddhist literature, the Vinaya, concerned ostensibly with the rules of monastic discipline, contains accounts of numerous incidents from the Buddha's life but rarely in the form of a continuous narrative. Biographical sections that do occur often conclude with the conversion of one of his early disciples, Shariputra. While the sutras focus on the person of the Buddha, his previous lives, his practice of austerities, his enlightenment, and his passage into nirvana, the Vinaya literature tends to emphasize his career as a teacher and the conversion of his early disciples. The sutras and Vinaya texts, thus, reflect concerns with both the Buddha's life and his teachings, concerns that often are interdependent. Early biographical accounts appear in doctrinal discourses, and points of doctrine and places of pilgrimage are legitimated through their connection to the life of the Buddha. Near the beginning of the Common Era, independent accounts of the life of the Buddha were composed. They do not recount his life from birth to death, often ending with his triumphant return to his native city of Kapilavastu, Pali, Kapilavastu, which is said to have taken place either 1 year or 6 years after his enlightenment. The partial biographies add stories that were to become well-known, such as the child prince's meditation under a rose apple tree and his 4 momentous chariot rides outside the city. These accounts typically make frequent reference to events from the previous lives of the Buddha. Indeed, collections of stories of the Buddha's past lives, called Jatakas, form one of the early categories of Buddhist literature. Here, an event reminds the Buddha of an event in a past life. He relates that story in order to illustrate a moral maxim, and, returning to the present, he identifies various members of his audience as the present incarnations of characters in his past life tale, with himself as the main character. The Jataka stories, one Pali collection contains 547 of them, have remained among the most popular forms of Buddhist literature. They are the source of some 32 stone carvings at the 2nd century BCE stupa at Barhat in northeastern Madhya Pradesh state. 15 stupa carvings depict the last life of the Buddha. Indeed, stone carvings in India provide an important source for identifying which events in the lives of the Buddha were considered most important by the community. The Jataka stories are also well known beyond India. In Southeast Asia, the story of Prince Vesantara, the Buddha's penultimate reincarnation, who demonstrates his dedication to the virtue of charity by giving away his sacred elephant, his children, and finally his wife, is as well known as that of his last lifetime. Lives of the Buddha that trace events from his birth to his death appeared in the 2nd century CE. One of the most famous is the Sanskrit poem Buddhacharita, Acts of the Buddha, by Ashvaghosha. Texts such as the Mulasarvastivada Vinaya, probably dating from the 4th or 5th century CE, attempt to gather the many stories of the Buddha into a single chronological account. The purpose of these biographies in many cases is less to detail the unique deeds of Shakyamuni's life than to demonstrate the ways in which the events of his life conform to a pattern that all Buddhas of the past have followed. According to some, all past Buddhas had left the life of the householder after observing the 4 sights, all had practiced austerities, all had achieved enlightenment at Bodh Gaya, all had preached in the deer park at Sarnath, and so on. The life of the Buddha was written and rewritten in India and across the Buddhist world, elements added and subtracted as necessary. Sites that became important pilgrimage places but that had not been mentioned in previous accounts would be retrospectively sanctified by the addition of a story about the Buddha's presence there. Regions that Buddhism entered long after his death, such as Sri Lanka, Kashmir, and Burma, now Myanmar, added narratives of his magical visitations to accounts of his life. No single version of the life of the Buddha would be accepted by all Buddhist traditions. For more than a century, scholars have focused on the life of the Buddha, with the earliest investigations attempting to isolate and identify historical elements amid the many legends. Because of the centuries that had passed between the actual life and the composition of what might be termed a full biography, most scholars abandoned this line of inquiry as unfruitful. Instead, they began to study the processes, social, political, institutional, and doctrinal, responsible for the regional differences among the narratives of the Buddha. The various uses made of the life of the Buddha are another topic of interest. In short, the efforts of scholars have shifted from an attempt to derive authentic information about the life of the Buddha to an effort to trace stages in and the motivations for the development of his biography. It is important to reiterate that the motivation to create a single life of the Buddha, beginning with his previous births and ending with his passage into nirvana, occurred rather late in the history of Buddhism. Instead, the biographical tradition of the Buddha developed through the synthesis of a number of earlier and independent fragments. And biographies of the Buddha have continued to be composed over the centuries and around the world. During the modern period, for example, biographies have been written that seek to demythologize the Buddha and to emphasize his role in presaging modern ethical systems, social movements, or scientific discoveries. What follows is an account of the life of the Buddha that is well known, yet synthetic, bringing together some of the more famous events from various accounts of his life, which often describe and interpret these events differently. Many biographies of the Buddha begin not with his birth in his last lifetime but in a lifetime millions of years before, when he first made the vow to become a Buddha. According to a well-known version, many eons ago there lived a Brahmin named, in some accounts, Sumita, who realized that life is characterized by suffering and then set out to find a state beyond death. He retired to the mountains, where he became a hermit, practiced meditation, and gained yogic powers. While flying through the air one day, he noticed a great crowd around a teacher, whom Sumita learned was the Buddha Dipamkara. When he heard the word Buddha, he was overcome with joy. Upon Dipamkara's approach, Sumita loosened his yogin's matted locks and laid himself down to make a passage across the mud for the Buddha. Sumita reflected that were he to practice the teachings of Dipamkara, he could free himself from future rebirth in that very lifetime. But he concluded that it would be better to delay his liberation in order to traverse the longer path to Buddhahood. As a Buddha, he could lead others across the ocean of suffering to the farther shore. Dipamkara paused before Sumita and predicted that many eons hence this yogin with matted locks would become a Buddha. He also prophesied Sumita's name in his last lifetime, Gautama, and the names of his parents and chief disciples, and described the tree under which the future Buddha would sit on the night of his enlightenment. Over the subsequent eons, the Bodhisattva would renew his vow in the presence of each of the Buddhas who came after Dipamkara, before becoming the Buddha Shakyamuni himself. Over the course of his lifetimes as a Bodhisattva, he accumulated merit, punya, through the practice of 6 or 10 virtues. After his death as Prince Vesantara, he was born in the Tusita heaven, whence he surveyed the world to locate the proper site of his final birth. Birth and early life. He determined that he should be born the son of the king Shuddhodana of the Shakya clan, whose capital was Kapilavastu. Shortly thereafter, his mother, the Queen Mahamaya, dreamed that a white elephant had entered her womb. 10 lunar months later, as she strolled in the garden of Lumbini, the child emerged from under her right arm. He was able to walk and talk immediately. A lotus flower blossomed under his foot at each step, and he announced that this would be his last lifetime. The king summoned the court astrologers to predict the boy's future. 7 agreed that he would become either a universal monarch, Chakravartin, or a Buddha. One astrologer said that there was no doubt the child would become a Buddha. His mother died 7 days after his birth, and so he was reared by his mother's sister, Mahaprajapati. As a young child, the prince was once left unattended during a festival. Later in the day he was discovered seated in meditation under a tree, whose shadow had remained motionless throughout the day to protect him from the sun. The prince enjoyed an opulent life. His father shielded him from exposure to the ills of the world, including old age, sickness, and death, and provided him with palaces for summer, winter, and the rainy season, as well as all manner of enjoyments, including in some accounts 40,000 female attendants. At age 16 he married the beautiful Princess Yashodhara. When the prince was 29, however, his life underwent a profound change. He asked to be taken on a ride through the city in his chariot. The king gave his permission, but first had all the sick and old people removed from the route. One old man escaped notice. Not knowing what stood before him, the prince was told that this was an old man. He was informed, also, that this was not the only old man in the world. Everyone, the prince, his father, his wife, and his kinsmen, would all one day grow old. The first trip was followed by 3 more excursions beyond the palace walls. On these trips he saw first a sick person, then a corpse being carried to the cremation ground, and finally a mendicant seated in meditation beneath a tree. Having been exposed to the various ills of human life, and the existence of those who seek a state beyond them, he asked the king for permission to leave the city and retire to the forest. The father offered his son anything if he would stay. The prince asked that his father ensure that he would never die, become ill, grow old, or lose his fortune. His father replied that he could not. The prince retired to his chambers, where he was entertained by beautiful women. Unmoved by the women, the prince resolved to go forth that night in search of a state beyond birth and death. When he had been informed 7 days earlier that his wife had given birth to a son, he said, "A fetter has arisen." The child was named Rahula, meaning fetter. Before the prince left the palace, he went into his wife's chamber to look upon his sleeping wife and infant son. In another version of the story, Rahula had not yet been born on the night of the departure from the palace. Instead, the prince's final act was to conceive his son, whose gestation period extended over the 6 years of his father's search for enlightenment. According to these sources, Rahula was born on the night that his father achieved Buddhahood. The prince left Kapilavastu and the royal life behind and entered the forest, where he cut off his hair and exchanged his royal robes for the simple dress of a hunter. From that point on he ate whatever was placed in his begging bowl. Early in his wanderings he encountered Bimbisara, the king of Magadha and eventual patron of the Buddha, who, upon learning that the ascetic was a prince, asked him to share his kingdom. The prince declined but agreed to return when he had achieved enlightenment. Over the next 6 years, the prince studied meditation and learned to achieve deep states of blissful concentration. But he quickly matched the attainments of his teachers and concluded that despite their achievements, they would be reborn after their death. He next joined a group of 5 ascetics who had devoted themselves to the practice of extreme forms of self-mortification. The prince also became adept at their practices, eventually reducing his daily meal to 1 pea. Buddhist art often represents him seated in the meditative posture in an emaciated form, with sunken eyes and protruding ribs. He concluded that mortification of the flesh is not the path to liberation from suffering and rebirth, and accepted a dish of rice and cream from a young woman. The Enlightenment. His companions remained convinced of the efficacy of asceticism and abandoned the prince. Now, without companions or a teacher, the prince vowed that he would sit under a tree and not rise until he had found the state beyond birth and death. On the full moon of May, 6 years after he had left his palace, he meditated until dawn. Mara, the god of desire, who knew that the prince was seeking to put an end to desire and thereby free himself from Mara's control, attacked him with wind, rain, rocks, weapons, hot coals, burning ashes, sand, mud, and darkness. The prince remained unmoved and meditated on love, thus transforming the hail of fury into a shower of blossoms. Mara then sent his 3 beautiful daughters, Lust, Thirst, and Discontent, to tempt the prince, but he remained impassive. In desperation, Mara challenged the prince's right to occupy the spot of earth upon which he sat, claiming that it belonged to him instead. Then, in a scene that would become the most famous depiction of the Buddha in Asian art, the prince, seated in the meditative posture, stretched out his right hand and touched the earth. By touching the earth, he was asking the goddess of the earth to confirm that a great gift that he had made as Prince Vesantara in his previous life had earned him the right to sit beneath the tree. She assented with a tremor, and Mara departed. The prince sat in meditation through the night. During the first watch of the night, he had a vision of all of his past lives, recollecting his place of birth, name, caste, and even the food he had eaten. During the second watch of the night, he saw how beings rise and fall through the cycle of rebirth as a consequence of their past deeds. In the third watch of the night, the hours before dawn, he was liberated. Accounts differ as to precisely what it was that he understood. According to some versions, it was the 4 truths of suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path to the cessation of suffering. According to others, it was the sequence of dependent origination, how ignorance leads to action and eventually to birth, aging, and death, and how when ignorance is destroyed, so also are birth, aging, and death. Regardless of their differences, all accounts agree that on this night he became a Buddha, an awakened one who had roused himself from the slumber of ignorance and extended his knowledge throughout the universe. The experience of that night was sufficiently profound that the prince, now the Buddha, remained in the vicinity of the tree up to 7 weeks, savoring his enlightenment. One of those weeks was rainy, and the Serpent King came and spread his hood above the Buddha to protect him from the storm, a scene commonly depicted in Buddhist art. At the end of 7 weeks, 2 merchants approached him and offered him honey and cakes. Knowing that it was improper for a Buddha to receive food in his hands, the gods of the 4 directions each offered him a bowl. The Buddha magically collapsed the 4 bowls into one and received the gift of food. In return, the Buddha plucked some hairs from his head and gave them to the merchants.